I am 76 years old, and though I still live in the same small house in rural Iowa where my late wife and I spent our entire married life, the walls feel increasingly foreign, as if they have grown taller and colder since she left me 4 years ago. The house has 3 rooms and a porch that creaks under the weight of every passing season, and in the evenings when the sun sinks behind the cornfields and the shadows crawl across the linoleum floor of my kitchen, I sometimes imagine the whole structure sighing under the burden of loneliness. My wife, Margaret, filled this place with a warmth that no heater could imitate. The smell of baked bread on Sundays, the gentle hum of her radio when she prepared supper, the sound of her knitting needles clicking in rhythm with the clock. When she died of a sudden heart attack, the house went silent, and though I can still walk through each room and touch her belongings, the warmth is gone, replaced by the hollow echo of memory. My days have become regimented, not because I have so much to do, but because routine is the only thing that keeps despair from overtaking me completely. I wake up before the sun rises, often because my sleep is shallow and restless, and shuffle to the kitchen to make my own coffee, which never tastes as rich as the way Margaret used to brew it. My hands shake when I measure the grounds, a tremor that began years ago and has gradually worsened, and sometimes I spill a few grains onto the counter, which I brush away with a kind of resigned irritation. These hands, though unsteady, are not useless. I still chop vegetables, wash my dishes, mend the buttons on my shirts, and write letters in long, trembling strokes that take time to decipher, but still carry my intent. Yet to my daughter, Emily, these same hands are nothing more than evidence of decay, a signal that her father is becoming a burden. Emily has not lived in Iowa for many years. She and her husband, Scott, moved to Des Moines when their careers began to flourish, and from there to Omaha, and now they live in a sleek suburban development outside Chicago. She is a financial planner, respected in her firm, with a reputation for being pragmatic, efficient, and unsentimental. Scott, her husband, is a lawyer who always wears tailored suits and speaks with the kind of practiced authority that makes people yield even when they do not agree. They have 2 children, my grandchildren, whom I have seen only sporadically in recent years, mostly at birthdays or graduations where the conversation felt stiff, as if we were polite strangers rather than family bound by blood. When Emily does call, her voice is brisk, as though she is squeezing our conversation between appointments. She asks if I have taken my medications, if I am paying my bills on time, if I have considered hiring a home aide. She never asks what I read in the evenings, or whether the roses in the backyard have bloomed yet, or if I miss her mother. She treats me like a project to be managed, an obligation on a checklist, and though I try not to resent it, the truth is that every clipped call leaves me feeling smaller, as though I am disappearing from her life piece by piece. My hands, with their restless trembling, seem to embody everything she despises: frailty, slowness, imperfection. When she visits, which is not often, she notices every small shake of the fork when I eat, every unsteady line in my handwriting, and I can see her filing these observations away, as though she is building a case against me, a dossier on my inevitable decline. I am not oblivious to my age, nor do I deny that my body is not what it once was. My knees ache when I climb the porch steps, my eyesight is blurred without glasses, and sometimes I forget the name of a neighbor's nephew or misplace the newspaper for a day. But my mind is still my own. I balance my checkbook, I read history books, and recall dates with clarity. I follow the news and understand more than some men half my age who sit glued to their televisions without questioning a word. I know who I am, I know where I am, and I know that the tremor in my hands is not the measure of my worth. Yet it has become the symbol Emily uses to define me. There are nights when I sit at the kitchen table long after dinner, the old clock ticking on the wall, and wonder when my daughter began to look at me, not as a father, but as a liability. Perhaps it was after Margaret's death, when Emily took charge of organizing the funeral and managing the paperwork with a level of efficiency that left me both grateful and uneasy. She spoke to the lawyer as if I were invisible, arranged the burial as though it were another appointment to be checked off, and afterward, while I sat stunned by grief, she asked casually if I had considered selling the house and moving into an assisted living facility. Her words were not cruel in tone, but they pierced me more deeply than if she had shouted, because in them I heard not care but calculation. Over time, this sense has only deepened, as though Emily has decided that my life is now a set of assets and liabilities to be managed for her convenience. And so I live my days quietly, walking to the store for bread, tending to the roses, repairing the same screen door again and again, and hoping for small signs of kindness that rarely come. My hands shake when I raise my coffee cup, when I sign my name at the pharmacy, when I write a letter to my old army friend in Minnesota. They are hands that once built furniture for my family, that once carried Emily on my shoulders when she was a little girl laughing in the summer sun, that once stroked Margaret's hair as she drifted to sleep. Now they betray me, trembling at the table, making me the object of my daughter's ridicule. I cannot control them entirely, but I can still control the story they will write, and though Emily may think they are weak, these hands have strength enough left to hold a pen, and a pen can change everything. It was Emily's idea to have a family dinner, the first in almost 2 years, and when she called to invite me, her tone carried that same brisk finality that suggested she had already made the decision for me, as if refusing were never an option. She said it would be good for everyone to gather, that the grandchildren wanted to see me, and that Scott had managed to book a table at an expensive restaurant downtown. I felt an uneasy mixture of excitement and dread, for although I longed to see my daughter and her children, I knew how these dinners tended to go, a performance of family unity that dissolved quickly into quiet judgments, barbed comments disguised as jokes, and the subtle yet unshakable feeling that I no longer belonged. Still, I ironed my best shirt, polished the shoes I had not worn in months, and rehearsed polite answers to the inevitable questions about my health and my daily routine, hoping to avoid embarrassment. When I arrived, they were already seated, the table glowing under the soft chandelier light, glasses of wine half full, laughter hanging in the air that ceased abruptly the moment I approached. Emily rose, kissed me lightly on the cheek, and guided me to the chair at the end of the table, the place that felt both honored and isolated, as though I were a guest of distinction, who, nevertheless, should be kept at a safe distance. The grandchildren nodded politely, their faces half buried in their phones, while Scott greeted me with the perfunctory firmness of a handshake that was more ritual than warmth. I tried to relax, to imagine that this was merely dinner, nothing more, nothing less. But even before the food arrived, I could sense the tension curling at the edges of the evening, like smoke before fire. When the plates were served, the tremor in my hands, which I had hoped would remain mild, grew worse, perhaps because of my nervousness, or perhaps because fate itself was determined to humiliate me that night. The fork rattled against the china as I tried to steady it, and a piece of salmon slipped back into the sauce, splattering a small stain on the white tablecloth. I dabbed at it quickly with a napkin, embarrassed but hoping it would pass unnoticed. Yet Emily's sharp laugh pierced the air, followed by her words spoken loud enough for the entire table to hear. "Dad, you're shaking like a leaf." "Careful, or they'll have to hose down the whole place when you're finished," Scott chuckled, raising his glass as though to toast her remark, and the grandchildren glanced up uncomfortable, then quickly backed down, unwilling to risk sharing in my shame or challenging their mother. My face burned with heat, and I muttered something about the air conditioning being too cold, but the damage was done, and for the rest of the meal Emily and Scott returned again and again to the subject of my hands, weaving little jabs into the conversation, making me the evening's entertainment. "Don't let Grandpa pour the wine, he might miss the glass," Scott quipped, and Emily followed with, "We should get him one of those toddler cups with a lid, that way he won't spill." They laughed together, or not cruelly in the way of outright malice, but with that polished ease of people who believe they are only joking, only teasing, as though the line between humor and cruelty did not matter so long as they could hide behind the thin veil of family banter. I sat in silence, each shake of my hand magnified under their gaze, each tremor transformed into evidence of my failing, until I no longer tasted the food and no longer cared to answer their questions. When dessert came, Emily leaned closer and, with a voice softened to mimic concern, said that perhaps it was time we had a serious conversation about the future, about whether I was truly managing on my own. She spoke of accidents that could happen, of houses too big for one person, of bills that might go unpaid if I forgot. Scott nodded gravely, supporting her, and together they painted a picture of me not as the man I still knew myself to be, but as a liability waiting to collapse, a frail figure, one misstep away from disaster. I told them gently but firmly that I was fine, that I managed everything myself, that I had no need for a nursing home or any kind of arrangement, but Emily's expression hardened, her mouth tightening into the familiar line that told me her mind was already made up. "You can't deny it forever," she said, her voice low but edged with steel. "And the sooner you accept it, the easier it will be for everyone." Scott added that he could help handle the paperwork, that he had friends in the legal field who could make the transition smooth, and though the words sounded practical, I heard the truth underneath. They wanted control, and this dinner was not about family at all, but about testing how far they could push me. When the bill arrived, Scott swept it up with theatrical gallantry, making a show of paying while glancing at me as if to underscore my dependence, and Emily patted my arm, a condescending gesture that carried no warmth, only authority. On the drive back to their house, where they had insisted I spend the night rather than return late to my own, Emily lectured me gently about the dangers of living alone, weaving in anecdotes of elderly clients she'd seen lose everything to forgetfulness or to scams, stories meant to frighten me into compliance. I listened in silence, staring out at the city lights flickering past the car window, and for the first time I felt something inside me shift, a dark certainty that this was not merely the thoughtless cruelty of a daughter mocking her father, but the careful prelude to a larger plan. That night, lying awake in the guest room with its sterile sheets and faint smell of lavender detergent, I realized the dinner had been a performance not for me, but for the children, for the witnesses, so that when the time came, they would remember. My trembling hands, my silence, my supposed decline. Emily was laying the groundwork, Scott was reinforcing it, and I, by my silence, was allowing them to write the story of my life as one of weakness. As I stared at the ceiling in the dark, I felt both despair and a flicker of resolve, for though my hands shook, my mind did not, and I began to understand that what had seemed like a family dinner was in truth the catalyst for a battle I could no longer avoid. The morning after that uneasy dinner, I awoke in the guest room of Emily's large suburban house, a place that looked like it had been copied directly from a glossy magazine, all polished wood floors and neutral-colored furniture that spoke of wealth, but not of warmth. The faint sounds of life drifted up the hallway, Scott's voice on the phone, low and professional, Emily's sharper tone directing the children to hurry, the clatter of dishes being stacked in the kitchen. I washed, dressed, and descended the stairs slowly, my knees aching with every step, and when I entered the kitchen, Emily looked up from her tablet with a smile that was practiced rather than spontaneous. "Good morning, Dad," she said brightly, pouring me a cup of coffee without asking how I took it, then sliding it across the counter as though she were serving a client instead of her own father. Scott glanced at me briefly, muttered a greeting, and returned to his call. The children barely acknowledged me, already halfway out the door with backpacks slung over their shoulders, absorbed in their own youthful world. I sat at the table, stirring the coffee to occupy my hands, and wondered if I truly belonged in this house at all. For though they had invited me, I felt more like a guest of obligation than of love. Emily sat down opposite me, folded her hands, and without preamble, said that she and Scott had been talking about me the night before, that they were worried, that my shaking hands and my apparent fatigue were signs that I could not go on living alone much longer. I tried to protest, to tell her that my home was manageable, that I cooked, cleaned, paid bills, even gardened, but she waved away my words with that impatient flick of her hand she had learned from her mother in adolescence. "Dad, denial doesn't help anyone," she said firmly, and then she produced a thin folder from the counter, sliding it toward me as though it were a breakfast menu. Inside, I saw brochures for assisted living facilities, glossy pages filled with smiling, elderly people, sitting in sunlit rooms or walking through manicured gardens. "These places are wonderful," Emily said, her voice softening as though to mask the manipulation. "You would have friends, nurses, safety, everything you need." I looked at her, stunned, and asked whether she had already visited them. She nodded proudly, saying she had taken tours, spoken to administrators, and gathered information about costs. You wouldn't have to worry about anything anymore, she added, and Scott and I could handle all the finances, make sure everything runs smoothly. At that moment, the truth settled heavily in my chest. She had not invited me to dinner to reconnect, but to prepare the ground for this conversation, to begin the process of moving me out of my life and into a managed box where she could control the remains of my existence. I told her quietly but firmly that I had no intention of leaving my home, that Margaret's memory lived in those walls, that I could still manage on my own. But Emily's expression hardened, and she said in a voice that carried the echo of her, "Professional authority, Dad, we're only trying to protect you. You don't see how fragile you've become, but we do. If something happened, if you fell or left the stove on, what then? Do you want that on your conscience?" The irony of her words stung me. She spoke of conscience as if she had one toward me, as if abandoning me to a sterile institution would be an act of love. I pushed the folder back across the table and said the discussion was over, that I would not sign anything, but she smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes from someone who believes time and inevitability are on their side. The rest of the day passed in a blur of subtle humiliations that did not appear cruel on the surface, but cut deeply nonetheless. Scott suggested that I let him drive me to the pharmacy to pick up my prescriptions, though I told him I had always managed the trip myself. At the counter, he loudly asked the pharmacist whether there were senior discounts, stressing my age as if it were a defect. When I reached for my wallet to pay, my hand trembled slightly, and Scott, gently but firmly, took the card from me, saying, "Don't worry, Dad. I've got this," though it was my own money and my own account. Later, Emily called her children into the living room and asked them to help Grandpa with the remote, handing it to me as if I had forgotten how to change a channel. And when I operated it perfectly well, she clapped her hands lightly, laughing, "See? He can still do some things." They all smiled politely, but the message was clear. I was being recast not as a capable man, but as a dependent figure, a performance being staged in front of the grandchildren so they would believe the narrative of decline when the time came. That evening, after enduring a dinner filled with more subtle barbs about my appetite, my shaking fork, and my slowness in responding to questions, I excused myself early and went to the guest room. On the desk, I noticed a stack of papers, partially tucked beneath a book, and though I told myself not to pry, something in me insisted I look. When I slid them free, my heart sank. It was a draft of a legal document, a power of attorney form already filled with my name, giving Emily and Scott the right to make financial and medical decisions on my behalf. My signature line was blank, but the rest was complete, as though they had expected me to sign without question, perhaps after being worn down by their arguments or embarrassed by my own clumsiness. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the papers, and felt a wave of betrayal so profound it nearly stole my breath. My own daughter, whom I had raised with love, whom I had carried through illness, whose college tuition I had paid, was preparing to strip me of my independence. I carefully slid the papers back as I had found them, and that night I slept little, turning over in my mind the realization that what I had dismissed as mere teasing or concern was in fact the beginning of a calculated campaign. The dinner had been the opening act, the folder of brochures the second, the power of attorney the third. They were escalating their efforts, step by step, building a case that I was incapable, preparing to take over not only my choices but my very identity. I thought of Margaret, of how fiercely she had defended her autonomy even when illness made her weak, and then I vowed silently that I would not surrender mine so easily. The next morning, I insisted on returning to my own house. Emily tried to protest, saying I should stay a few more days, but I packed my bag and called a taxi before she could stop me. As the car pulled away from her manicured driveway, I looked back at her figure standing on the porch, her arms crossed, her face unreadable, and I knew that the battle between us had only just begun. What she had begun with smiles and polished brochures would continue with sharper tactics, and if I was not careful, I would lose everything. Yet even as fear coiled in my stomach, a spark of defiance burned within me, for I knew that though my hands shook, my mind remained steady, and I would need every ounce of that steadiness for what lay ahead. Back in my own house, the air felt both like a refuge and like a warning. for though I had escaped Emily's immediate reach, I knew her intentions had not been abandoned. I returned to my rituals, brewing my coffee, watering the roses, reading my books, but beneath the surface of these routines was a constant hum of unease, a sense that the walls of my independence were being slowly, invisibly dismantled. My hands shook more than usual, perhaps from nerves, and one afternoon, as I tried to write a letter to an old army friend, I looked at the uneven lines on the page and felt a wave of despair. Were Emily and Scott right? Was I truly slipping? Or were they simply waiting for me to believe that I was? That night, sleep eluded me, and I rose to fetch water from the kitchen, when I noticed an envelope pushed halfway under my front door. It had no stamp, only my name written in a neat hand. Inside was a letter from my neighbor, an elderly widow named Mrs. Adler, who apologized for the intrusion but felt compelled to tell me that Emily had visited her earlier that week. According to Mrs. Adler, my daughter had spoken in a grave, concerned tone about my confusion, about how I sometimes forgot conversations or left things unattended, and had hinted that I might soon be moving to a safer place. Mrs. Adler, who knew me well enough to doubt these claims, wrote that she felt something was wrong and wanted me to be aware. I sat at the kitchen table with that letter trembling in my hand, realizing that Emily was not only preparing documents but also laying a social foundation, spreading whispers in the neighborhood so that when she acted, others would nod in agreement and say they had seen it coming. The next day confirmed my fears. When I went to the bank to withdraw cash, the teller hesitated, then politely asked me to wait while she spoke to a manager. The manager, a woman I had known for years, approached with a rehearsed calm and explained that there had been a request to place additional oversight on my accounts due to concerns about possible cognitive decline. My heart pounded as she explained that my daughter had come in with documents, not yet finalized, but intended to prove she had authority to oversee my finances. I argued, perhaps more angrily than I intended, that I was perfectly capable of managing my own money, and after verifying my identity and my long record of clear transactions, the manager relented, saying nothing had yet been enacted. But I saw in her eyes the seed of doubt Emily had planted, and I understood that the war had moved from private discussions to official institutions, from whispered jokes to tangible threats. That night, I searched through my desk drawer where Margaret had kept every important paper of our marriage, deeds, wills, insurance policies. My trembling hands sifted through decades of documents until I found something I had half forgotten, a joint amendment Margaret and I had signed years earlier when she was still alive and sharp-minded. It was a clause she had insisted upon after hearing a story from a friend. If any heir attempted to challenge our competence or tried to assume control of our estate without cause, that heir's claim to inheritance would be forfeited. At the time I had humored her, not believing our daughter would ever sink so low. But now, staring at the bold, notarized words, I felt as though Margaret herself had reached from beyond the grave to shield me. My hands trembled, but not with weakness, with something closer to awe, for what Emily had mocked as a frailty was in fact the reason my wife's foresight still lived in ink upon those pages. The discovery changed everything. For the first time since the humiliating dinner, I felt not only anger, but also strategy taking root. Emily's path forward relied on convincing the world that I was slipping, that my shaking hands were evidence of a failing mind. Yet here was a legal safeguard that could turn her scheme into her undoing. If she pressed too hard, if she attempted to enact power of attorney or forced guardianship, she risked disinheriting herself entirely. The thought gave me both relief and sorrow, relief that I was not defenseless, sorrow that I had reached a point where I must wield protection against my own child. Still I resolved that if she wished to play this cruel game, she would find that her father was not the helpless figure she imagined. In the days that followed, small signs of Emily's pressure campaign continued to appear. I received a phone call from a clinic I had never visited telling me they had been asked to schedule a cognitive assessment. A neighbor mentioned casually that Emily had stopped by to check whether I seemed safe alone. Even the pastor at my church inquired gently about whether I needed help managing my affairs. Each encounter felt like another stone added to the wall being built around me, a wall meant to box me into the role of an invalid. Yet now, armed with Margaret's claws and the knowledge of Emily's maneuvering, I no longer felt paralyzed. I began to keep a journal, meticulously recording every phone call, every visit, every incident, my shaky handwriting, forming a record that would prove my awareness. I contacted an old friend who was a retired lawyer, asking discreet questions about estate protections and power of attorney laws. He assured me that as long as I was lucid, and he confirmed I sounded as sharp as ever, Emily would face serious obstacles, especially with the inheritance clause in place. The midpoint of this struggle had revealed itself with cruel clarity. Emily's campaign to portray me as feeble was not speculation, but fact, already in motion, already whispering through neighbors, banks, and doctors. Yet it had also revealed something she could not anticipate, that the very hands she mocked, the hands that trembled over documents years ago, had signed the clause that now hung over her like a silent verdict. The knowledge hardened me, steadied me, and though I still felt the sting of her betrayal, I also felt the first glimmer of strength, a determination not merely to endure, but to resist. For I understood now that the battle was not about my weakness, but about her greed, that my task was not only to survive, but to make her face the consequences of her cruelty. I did not wait for the next blow to fall. I braced for it by turning my small kitchen into a war room and my trembling hands into instruments of record, because once I understood that Emily had crossed the line from thoughtless mockery to deliberate. Construction of a case against me, every creak on the porch and every ring of the phone, felt like the sound of a trap being tightened, and I knew that if I wanted to keep my life, I had to move first, even while pretending to stand still. I called Harold, the retired attorney who had once played cards with Margaret and me on Friday nights, and asked him to come by under the pretense of sharing coffee and old stories. And when he sat at my table, I told him the truth without embroidery. The dinner, the brochures, the draft power of attorney on the desk, the neighbor's letter, the banker's cautious eyes, the clinic that called me without my asking. Harold listened with that patient, weathered look of men who have watched many families break over money, and then he told me quietly that he had seen this play before, that once a child decides a parent's frailty is a lever, the levers multiply, until the whole life is pried open and taken piece by piece, unless the parent is willing to become, for a time, someone sterner than love would prefer. He took my files, examined the clause Margaret had insisted upon, and he nodded with real respect at her foresight. Then, using my kitchen table as a desk, he drafted what he called a fortress of paper, a living trust that retitled my home and my accounts into an entity with me as trustee and with successor trustees who were not Emily and not anyone who owed Emily a favor, a crisp letter revoking any prior powers of attorney and designations, a medical directive naming my old pastor and Harold's paralegal as my advocates, and a set of notices to my bank and insurance company that no one, no matter their relation, was to be granted information or authority absent my voice or a court order. He urged me to take a cognitive assessment, not because he doubted my clarity, but because the best defense against a future lie is a present truth written by a neutral hand, and he explained that a video of me reading a statement and signing, dated, witnessed and notarized, could serve as a living rebuttal when the time came. The paperwork looked like a mountain, and my hands did what they always do, fluttering at the edges of the pages like frightened birds. Yet when I picked up the pen and bore down until the nib scratched the paper, my lines, though wavering, marched forward with a stubbornness that felt like a prayer. Harold steadied the pages so I would not smear the ink, and I signed my name again and again, feeling the weight of each letter as something more than legal formality, as the articulation of my refusal to be erased. 2 days later, the escalation began in earnest, no longer whispered through friendly faces, but pushed through official channels designed to make an old man doubt his own reflection. A uniformed officer knocked on my door for a wellness check after an anonymous caller reported that I had been wandering at night and leaving the stove on. The officer was polite, almost apologetic, and after he walked through the rooms and found nothing amiss, he advised me to keep a list of my medications on the refrigerator, just in case, which I did, not because I felt unwell, but because even the truth benefits from organization. A letter arrived from a county social worker requesting a home visit to assess whether I might qualify for services, the kind of letter that sounds generous until you recognize it as the prelude to a competence review. I called Harold, who called the social worker, and together they agreed that any visit would take place with Harold present and with a copy of my recent cognitive screening on file. When I went to the pharmacy to refill a prescription, the young clerk told me gently that my primary insurance had been changed to a new policy and that they would need the updated card. And for one dizzy moment, the floor seemed to tilt. Then I remembered Harold's warning and marched over to the insurance agent's office with my folder under my arm, where I learned that a request to change my primary contact and authorized representative had been submitted online from an account with my name. But an unfamiliar email address, the agent, confronted with my identification and Harold's letter revoking all prior authorizations, flagged the account and restored the settings, and I left with a paper trail proving that someone, my daughter or someone guided by her, had attempted to step into my life wearing my signature like a stolen coat. That night I received a text from my grandson, not cruel but chilled by distance, that said, "Mom says you really scared the waitress at dinner and that you blamed everyone else when they tried to help." And although I knew he was only repeating what he had been told, the words slid into my heart like a thin knife, because the tactics now included not only institutions, but blood, a reshaping of memory inside the minds of those who should have been my defenders. A week after the wellness check came the legal blow. A courier delivered a notice that Scott had filed a petition for temporary guardianship, asserting that I was at risk of financial exploitation and self-neglect, and attached to the petition were 2 affidavits from a physician's assistant and a psychologist I had never met, both claiming that based on family reports and observed functional decline, I was unlikely to manage my affairs without harm. Harold read the documents and swore under his breath, then looked at me with steady eyes and said we would fight on paper and in person, that the judge assigned to these cases had little patience for vague accusations, that the remedy for lies was light, and that light would be my records, my assessments, my daily journals, and even the silly evidence of order that fills an ordinary life. The neatly stacked bills stamped paid, the grocery lists, the garden schedule, the calendars with church. Dates and repairs logged in my shaky hand. His paralegal scheduled an independent evaluation with a neurologist whose reports are trusted by the court. I sat in the doctor's quiet office and answered questions that asked me to remember lists, draw shapes, interpret proverbs, and name the month backward, and the doctor, himself an old man with a gentle patience, told me at the end that whatever my hands were doing, my mind was as clear as the autumn sky. We filmed my reading of a statement in which I described calmly and without accusation what had transpired since the dinner. I spoke not like a victim, but like a witness, careful with each word, and when I finished, I looked into the lens and said, "For the record and for my own courage, that a man is not the sum of his tremors, that his dignity is not measured by steadiness, but by truth." Emily did not stop. She merely shifted tactics when she realized the court would not grant anything ex parte without more substance. She began to send me little kindnesses with poisoned hooks, a bag of groceries left on the porch with a note that said, "You forgot to buy milk again, Dad." But there was fresh milk sitting in my refrigerator, a gas company technician arriving, unannounced because the family had reported a strange smell, which forced a day-long inspection and ended with a sticker on the furnace to document a complaint that had never been made by me. A package addressed to me containing a set of oversized pill organizers to prevent mistakes, a gift that made the neighbors nod approvingly and made me feel like an actor trapped in a play where everyone had already learned their lines except for me. I discovered that my mail had been temporarily forwarded to a P.O. box for 3 days before the post office flagged the change as suspicious. The clerk showed me the form with my name written in a print that resembled mine just enough to fool a stranger, and I felt a cold anger so complete that my hands, for once, stopped shaking. Harold pressed the postmaster for documentation, and we added forgery to the growing list of indignities. Through his contacts, we also learned the motive behind the speed and intensity of their push. Scott's name had appeared in a brief complaint before the state bar after a client alleged that retainer funds had been mishandled, and while the matter had not yet matured into a formal investigation, their savings were thin, their mortgage had been refinanced, and Emily carried a quiet burden from a series of risky investments at her firm that had not paid off. In other words, they needed a cushion and a narrative that would justify seizing my finances quickly while claiming the sainthood of caretakers. I would like to say this revelation softened me with pity, but the truth is that it hardened me further, because need does not license theft, and fear does not baptize betrayal. On Harold's advice, I executed a final series of acts that felt both empowering and bleak. I changed beneficiaries on my life insurance to the church scholarship fund Margaret had loved, and I set the trust to include an in terrorem clause that echoed and amplified the one Margaret and I had signed long ago, specifying that any heir who petitioned for my guardianship without clear medical cause or who attempted to alter my accounts without consent would be deemed to have predeceased me for purposes of distribution. I closed the small joint savings account Emily and I had kept from her college days and redirected every automatic bill to the trust. I installed a doorbell camera and a simple system that recorded visits, not to catch thieves, but to capture the rituals of my daily competence, as if I were testifying to the future that I had lived in order and not in chaos. I wrote to the bank, the insurance company, and the county clerk requesting that any document purporting to bear my signature be checked against the specimen signatures attached to Harold's letter. The bank manager, now fully on my side, placed a note on my file that any request from Emily or Scott be referred to the legal department. I called my pastor and told him the truth in a halting voice that felt like the oldest prayer, that my daughter had decided my tremor meant I should be buried alive in paperwork and care plans, that I might need a witness to the fact that I was still myself. He came by with warm bread and a quiet blessing, and when he left he told me he would testify if it came to that. Emily's next move arrived like a storm dressed as sunshine. She called one afternoon with a softness I'd not heard since she was a girl who needed help with homework, and she said she had been thinking things over and that perhaps we had all overreacted, that she wanted to come by with Scott and talk like family. Against Harold's advice I agreed, not out of naivete, but because there are certain rituals a father must try before he consigns himself to war without truce. When they arrived, they were dressed not for combat, but for persuasion. Emily in a pale sweater that made her look younger, Scott with his tie loosened as if to suggest informality. They brought a pie from the bakery I love and made tea as though the kitchen belonged to them, and for half an hour we reminisced about Margaret as if the last month had not happened. Then Emily slid a folder across the table with a tender, almost embarrassed look, and said there was a simple way to stop all this ugliness, a temporary arrangement that would give everyone peace, if I would sign a limited power of attorney that allowed Scott to manage my major bills and permitted Emily to speak to my doctors. All the rumors and filings could be withdrawn, and we could go back to normal. I opened the folder and found, as I expected, that the limitation was an illusion. The document was broad and springing, the definitions of major bills, expansive enough to swallow everything, the medical language written to allow substitution in the event of apparent confusion, a phrase so vague it could fit any bad day of any aging man's life. I closed the folder and pushed it back gently, and I told my daughter in a voice that shook only slightly that I had already signed my protection, that my house and my accounts were in trust, that any further attempts to strip me of my will would result in consequences not of my choosing but of her own making, because of the clause her mother had insisted upon. The look that passed over Emily's face in that moment was a revelation and a wound. Not shame, not sorrow, but calculation interrupted by surprise, a mind that had not accounted for an obstacle placed by a woman she had thought too sentimental to be severe. Scott's jaw tightened, and he said evenly that trust can be contested, that judges can be persuaded, that shaky signatures do not survive scrutiny. I looked at him and felt a calm that surprised me, and I said that my tremor does not weaken the law, and that the only thing shakier than my hand was the foundation of their story, and that if they continued I would light every room they had tried to make dark. They left without shouting, which somehow felt worse than if they had slammed the door, because The quiet meant calculation, and in the days that followed the pressure did not abate but shifted again, this time to the soft underbelly of community and memory. At church, a woman I have known since Emily was small asked if I had considered a move closer to family, and her eyes slid away when I said no. At the grocery store, the clerk offered, unasked, to carry my bags, because sometimes folks forget, and I realized that the portrait Emily had painted of me was hung in every hallway I walked. Yet even as the social temperature cooled around me, the legal temperature heated toward a boil, because Harold received notice that the guardianship petition had been amended with new incidents, including a claim that I had given a large cash gift to a stranger at the door and that I had been heard at night confessing disorientation. Harold gathered affidavits from neighbors who had not seen these events, pulled security clips from my doorbell, and prepared the kind of filing that is less a defense than a dismantling. He also uncovered the last, most cynical measure in their escalation. Emily had changed the beneficiary designation on an old, small life insurance policy I had nearly forgotten, using credentials obtained through that brief mail-forwarding stunt to add herself as primary and to remove the church program. We reversed the change, documented the attempt, and prepared to include it in our response as proof of motive. By the time the hearing date arrived, I felt like a man standing in the hush before a storm breaks. Not because I was afraid to be judged, but because I had finally accepted that the child I had loved was willing to argue in public that her father was already gone while he stood before her. I shaved carefully, pressed my good shirt, placed my journal and the evaluation and a copy of Margaret's Clause in a neat stack for Harold, and I sat at the table where so many signatures now lay sleeping in their folders. My hands shook, as they always do, and I watched the ripple of their movement in the morning light as if they were a weather vane, recording the pressure of all that had passed. These hands are not steady, I told myself, but they are faithful. They tremble, but they witness. They record not just my imperfection, but my will. Whatever happened next, I had done what I could. I had met escalation with preparation, cruelty with paper, rumor with record, and the black comedy of being declared absent while still present with the stubborn devotion of a man who refuses to be edited out of his own life. The courthouse was colder than I expected, not in temperature alone, but in atmosphere, as if the very walls had absorbed years of sorrow and family betrayals, carrying the echoes of children testifying against parents, of siblings dividing, inheritances like spoils of husbands and wives laying bare their bitterness. I walked slowly through the security line, my cane clicking softly against the tiled floor, Harold at my side with his leather briefcase bulging with documents, affidavits, and notarized letters. My heart pounded with a rhythm I could not control, but my mind felt calm, almost eerily so, as though everything had led to this point and I could no longer turn back. Emily and Scott were already seated at the petitioner's table when I entered, both impeccably dressed, their posture rigid, the air of righteousness radiating from them like perfume. Emily avoided my eyes at first, pretending to shuffle papers, but when she finally looked up, I saw not shame or hesitation, but a steeliness that reminded me of her mother in her fiercest moments, except stripped of compassion. She was determined to win, to prove her version of reality, and she believed the courtroom would lend her the authority that her laughter at dinner could not. The judge, an older man with white hair and heavy glasses, entered and began the proceedings without preamble. Scott, acting as Emily's representative, rose and spoke first. His voice was smooth, professional, the cadence of a man used to persuasion, and he laid out their case in terms carefully chosen to sound protective rather than greedy. He described my advanced tremors, my increasing isolation, my supposed lapses in judgment. He cited the affidavits they had gathered, the rumors they had spread until they became pseudo-facts, and when he gestured towards me, he did so with the solemnity of someone pointing out a patient rather than a parent. Emily dabbed at her eyes once, theatrically, when he spoke of her worry that I might fall and not be found for days. The performance was smooth, almost airtight, until Harold rose with his measured calm. Harold began not with an attack, but with a declaration that the presumption of competence was not a gift from the law, but its foundation, and that any child who sought to strip a parent of that presumption carried the burden of proof heavier than stone. Then he produced, one by one, the pieces of evidence we had prepared. The notarized cognitive assessment signed by the neurologist, declaring me lucid and unimpaired. The video recording of me reading a statement in clear, unwavering voice, describing in detail the sequence of events that had brought us here. The affidavits from neighbors attesting that I had never wandered, never forgotten my stove, never gifted money to strangers. The letter from the bank manager confirming the attempted but blocked changes to my accounts. The notice from the insurance company reversing unauthorized beneficiary alterations. Each page struck like a hammer, not loud but steady, each one widening the cracks in the case Emily and Scott had built. Finally, Harold laid down the clause Margaret had insisted upon, the inheritance condition written years ago, signed by both of us, witnessed, notarized, indelible. He read it aloud, his voice echoing in the chamber, that any heir who challenged our competence or attempted to seize control of our affairs without just cause would be considered, in the eyes of the estate, to have predeceased us. A hush fell over the room, and for the first time Emily's composure slipped. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes flickered toward Scott, and though she recovered quickly, I saw the tremor of realization pass through her. Harold did not gloat, did not raise his voice. He simply let the words rest there like a stone in the middle of the road, immovable. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly, my legs unsteady, but my voice stronger than it had been in years. I did not launch into accusations. I spoke simply, telling the judge that my hands shook, but my mind did not, that I managed my home, that I paid my bills, that I remembered the birthdays of my grandchildren, even if they rarely remembered mine. I told him that my daughter had laughed at me in a restaurant, that my son-in-law had prepared papers in secret, that I had been made to feel like a ghost in my own life before I had died. I spoke not with the anger of a victim, but with the dignity of a man who wanted only the truth to stand. My voice cracked when I said Margaret's name, when I explained that she had foreseen this possibility and written protections that now lived on paper as fiercely as she once lived beside me. The judge listened without interruption, his pen scratching occasionally, but his eyes fixed on me with a steadiness that made me believe he heard not only my words, but the years behind them. Scott attempted a rebuttal, pointing out my shaking hands as though the visible tremor could nullify every piece of evidence, but the judge cut him off sharply, reminding him that physical frailty was not mental incapacity, that dignity was not measured in muscle steadiness. When Emily tried to interject with a story about how she had found unpaid bills in my house, Harold calmly produced the receipts, dated and cleared. That proved otherwise. Every stone they threw was caught and returned with documentation. The courtroom, which had begun with the air of inevitability leaning toward them, shifted slowly, perceptibly, until the weight of truth settled firmly on my side. In the final moments, the judge leaned forward and delivered his decision. The petition for guardianship was denied, dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could not be filed again without new and substantial evidence. He acknowledged the tremor in my hands, but affirmed my mental competence unequivocally. Then, with a pause that seemed to stretch across generations, he noted the clause in the will and trust, and while he said it was not his role to interpret inheritance disputes in this hearing, he remarked that it stood as a solemn warning to any who might mistake parental weakness for opportunity. His gavel struck once, a single solid sound, and the case was over. As the courtroom emptied, Emily lingered, her face pale and tight, while Scott gathered their papers with stiff, jerking motions. She approached me once, as though to speak, but when I looked into her eyes, she faltered, muttered something about hoping I would be safe, and turned away. For the first time, I felt no urge to reach out, no desire to soften the blow. She had chosen her path, and in doing so, she had carved a canyon between us too wide for words to bridge. I walked out into the sunlight with Harold, the cold of the courthouse replaced by the warmth of the day, and though my hands trembled worse than ever, my heart felt strangely still, as though the storm had broken and left behind a sky clear enough for me to breathe again. When the gavel fell and the courthouse emptied, I thought the relief would be immediate and total, but instead it came in layers, a slow unwinding of knots that had been tied in my chest for months. Harold drove me home, and as we pulled into the familiar driveway, I looked at the roses Margaret and I had planted, their stems brittle in the late-season air, and I felt a gratitude that bordered on grief. I was still in my home, still master of my days, but the cost of proving that simple truth had been heavy. Harold carried the thick folder of documents inside and set it on the kitchen table as though it were a shield now laid to rest. And when he left with a firm handshake and a quiet promise to remain close if I needed him, I sat alone in the silence that followed. It was the silence of victory, yes, but also of loss, for nothing could erase the fact that my own daughter had stood in court to declare me unfit to live my own life. In the days that followed, I noticed the small things first. The way neighbors who had once looked at me with doubt now greeted me with warmth again. The way the bank teller smiled and asked about my garden instead of hesitating with my withdrawals. The way the pharmacist handed me my prescriptions without a second glance. The whispers had quieted, the shadows Emily had cast had thinned, and in their place came a cautious respect, as though the community realized they had nearly consigned me to a living grave on hearsay alone. I kept my routines intact, more carefully than ever, not out of paranoia, but as a kind of declaration. I mowed the lawn, paid bills on time, attended Sunday service, and carried myself, not as a man rescued, but as a man who had defended his right to remain himself. My hands shook as they always did, but I no longer cursed them. They were not proof of decline. They were the very hands that had signed the protections Margaret had insisted on, the hands that had carried me through war, through marriage, through the raising of a child who had now become my adversary. They trembled, but they endured, and so did I. Emily did not call me after the hearing. Weeks passed in silence, and I learned from a neighbor that she had taken her children on a trip, perhaps to distract them from the whispers that had now turned against her. Scott's practice faltered. I read in the local paper about a formal inquiry into his accounts, and though I felt no joy at his misfortune, I recognized the symmetry. The hands that had reached for what was not theirs had been caught not only by me, but by their own greed. There was talk among extended family, cousins, nieces, that Emily had crossed a line too severe to mend, that the will's clause had placed her inheritance in jeopardy, and though I did not relish their gossip, I let them speak. The truth no longer needed my defense. It had spoken for itself. One evening, near the end of autumn, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and watched the sun sink low behind the trees, painting the sky in Margaret's favorite shades of gold and crimson. I thought of her then, not as the ghost I had clung to in my loneliness, but as the partner who had, even in death, protected me. Her insistence on that clause, her stubborn refusal to leave our legacy unguarded, had been the difference between ruin and survival. I whispered her name into the cooling air, a prayer and a thank you, and I felt, for the first time in years, that she was not simply gone, but present in the decisions that had saved me. As winter approached, I began writing letters, not to Emily. There was nothing left to say that would not reopen wounds, but to my grandchildren. I told them stories of their mother when she was young, of the nights she sat on my lap while I read her books, of the mornings she helped Margaret bake bread. I wrote not to erase what she had done, but to remind them that their lineage was not only betrayal. Whether they read the letters or not, whether Emily intercepted them or not, I could not know, but the act of writing gave me peace. It was my way of refusing to let the story end with bitterness alone. I will not pretend that forgiveness came. It did not. What Emily attempted was too grave, too deliberate. But I found a strange kind of balance in accepting that my role was no longer to win back her love, but to guard my dignity until the end of my days. That realization lifted a weight I had carried since the night she laughed at me in that restaurant. I no longer waited for reconciliation. I no longer prayed for her change of heart. I lived instead for the simple freedoms she had tried to take, the right to wake in my own bed, to drink coffee at my own table, to walk among my roses, to sign my name with trembling hands that still belonged to me. Now, when I look at those hands, I see them not as a mark of weakness, but as the truest record of my life. They shake because they have worked, they have fought, They have held too much and let go of too much, and in their quiver lies the whole truth of my years. Emily mocked them, tried to turn them into evidence of my ruin, but they became instead the instruments of her undoing, the proof that her father, though frail in body, was unbroken in will. And as I sit in the quiet of this house, Margaret's house, my house, I understand that the final victory is not in any courtroom or clause, but in the simple endurance of my days, lived freely until the end.